There is a covenant deep in the human mind. A simple, animal truth. To hit a thing, you must aim at the thing. From the first stone thrown to the first bullet fired, this instinct has been our guide. You see? You point. You destroy. Now take that instinct and place it at 20,000 feet. The year is 1942. The air is so thin it burns, and the cold is a physical weight. You are a 19-year-old boy, standing in the vibrating belly of a B-17, gripping a machine gun. A shape flashes in the distance, a silver cross, an enemy fighter. It slides across your field of view, impossibly fast. You do what every nerve in your body commands. You place your sights directly on its fuselage, you lead it just a little, and you squeeze the trigger. A torrent of tracers, bright yellow lines, screams across the sky. And you watch, in silent horror, as every single one of them passes harmlessly behind the fighter's tail. The bullets curve away as if repelled by a ghost. The enemy pilot doesn't even bother to take evasive action. He continues on, untouched, as your ammunition counter spins towards zero. This was not one man's failure. It was a plague. Across every theater of the war, thousands of American gunners, brave men with the finest weapons in the world, were missing. Constantly. The Army Air Forces, desperate for an answer, studied the gun camera footage. The results were not just bad, they were catastrophic. Against a target crossing their path, trained gunners were achieving a hit rate below 4%. Think about that. For every 100 rounds fired, 96 hit nothing but empty air. In a 10-second engagement, a gunner might fire 130 rounds. A 4% hit rate meant maybe 5 bullets would strike the target. 5 rounds were not enough to stop a rugged German fighter. They were an annoyance. The cost of this failure was measured in letters home that suddenly stopped. In 1943, the 8th Air Force, flying over Europe, was losing an average of 188 bombers every month. Each bomber carried 10 men. That is 1,880 sons, husbands, and fathers, killed or captured every 30 days. They were flying in formations that could not defend themselves. The crews weren't cowards. The guns weren't broken. The problem was physics. And the villain of this story was not the man in the other cockpit. The villain was time. The gap was almost imperceptible. A bullet from a Browning M2 travels fast, around 2,900 feet per second, but the target, a Zero or a Messerschmitt, was screaming through the sky at 300 miles per hour. That's over 440 feet every single second. Do the math on a 300-yard shot. The bullet, as fast as it was, needed about 1/3 of a second to cover that distance. In that 1/3 of a second, the enemy plane had already moved 136 feet forward. The gunners were aiming where the plane was. The bullets were arriving where the plane had been. They weren't shooting at a target. They were shooting at a memory. This fatal phenomenon had a name: deflection error. The most tragic part? Someone had seen it coming. The prophecy was written in 1924, buried deep in an Army archive. Lieutenant Colonel James Puckle, an artillery officer, published a paper titled The Problem of Lead in Aerial Gunnery. As biplane speeds were barely passing 150 miles per hour, Puckle did the calculations. He foresaw a crisis. He demonstrated that as speeds increased, the deflection required would become so massive that it would defy human intuition. He calculated that a gunner would need to aim 4 to 5 full aircraft lengths ahead of the target's nose. Not at the engine. Not at the propeller. At a patch of completely empty sky. His conclusion was stark. Without mechanical assistance, aerial gunners would be rendered effectively useless within a decade. The Army filed his paper and forgot about it. For 18 years, that paper gathered dust. As the military trained a new generation of gunners, they taught the old ways: marksmanship, sight picture, trigger control. They were training riflemen for a 3-dimensional chase they couldn't comprehend. In mid-1943, with losses mounting to unsustainable levels, a desperate captain named Robert Williams, digging through the archives, found Puckle's paper. The blood must have drained from his face. He knew. Puckle had predicted this exact disaster, and hundreds of men had paid the price for it being ignored. The question was no longer what the problem was. The question was how to fix it. How do you teach a terrified man to fire at nothing, to trust math over his own eyes, while being shot at? The solution came from two separate paths, one of a machine and one of the mind. The first answer was already emerging in Britain. During the Battle of Britain in 1940, RAF pilots faced the same crisis, posting a miserable 6% hit rate. Squadron leader Horace Darley, a competitive clay pigeon shooter, had a radical idea. He knew the best shotgunners didn't calculate lead. They felt it. He grounded his entire squadron in the middle of the battle. He had them make pass after pass at a towed target, but he gave them an insane order. Don't aim, don't think, fire while you are still turning to follow. Let the motion of your turn create the lead. At first, it was a disaster, but by the third day, their hit rates had doubled. Darley was teaching them to use their subconscious, to overwrite their faulty instincts with a new, correct one. But this was a solution for a fighter pilot, a man who flew his own gun. What about the bomber gunner, a man standing still in a metal tube, unable to turn into his target? His brain was the only tool he had. And his brain was failing him. If the human brain was too slow, it would have to be bypassed. The task fell to the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, to a brilliant engineer named Dr. Charles Stark Draper. He and his team built what was, for its time, a miracle. It was called the Mark 14 Computing Gun Sight. It was a 28-pound box of gyroscopes, cams, and gears, a tiny, mechanical, analog computer. The gunner no longer had to guess. He simply dialed in the target's wingspan to give the sight the range, and then tracked the enemy plane for 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, the gyroscope felt the target's speed and angle. The internal gears solved Puckle's complex equations 30 times every second. The sight then projected a glowing dot of light onto the glass. That dot was the solution. It wasn't on the target. It floated ahead of it, in that patch of empty sky. The gunner's new job was simple. Put the dot on the plane. The machine would handle the deflection. The results were stunning. Gunners who had never broken 5% hit rates were, on their first day with the Mark 14, hitting 18%. After a week, they were hitting 25%. It was a 5-fold increase in lethality. The machine's brain was proving superior to the humans. The Mark 14 was a war winner, but it was complex. It took time to build, time to install, and men were dying now. The fleet flying in late 1943 and early 1944 still had their old, simple sights. They needed an answer that didn't require a factory. That answer came from the Pacific. It came not from an engineer, but from a combat veteran. Staff Sergeant William Bill Fleming, a gunner with air group support, had survived 31 missions. He had fired approximately 40,000 rounds in combat, and he had kept a notebook. His notebook was not filled with theory. It was filled with simple sketches of enemy planes, and hand-drawn lines showing where he had actually aimed when he got a hit. He presented his notebook to his commander, the legendary ace Butch O'Hare. O'Hare saw it immediately. This was empirical data, gathered in blood. Fleming wasn't guessing. He had taught himself Puckle's math without knowing it. His system was brutally simple. He had created a new visual language. For a target crossing at a shallow angle, he aimed 1 plane length ahead of its nose. For a moderate angle, 2 plane lengths. For a steep 90-degree pass, 3 or more plane lengths. It was called the spot shooting method. It was genius because it gave the human brain a simple visual rule it could follow under fire. A gunner couldn't calculate 136 feet, but he could see the enemy plane, and he could count 1, 2, 3 plane lengths forward into empty space. The technique spread like wildfire. The Navy's hit rates on the carrier Lexington more than doubled. The Army Air Forces adopted it, calling it radius of action shooting. It was the bridge. It was the practical, human solution that could be taught today, while waiting for the machine solution of tomorrow. They had the tools. They had the technique. But one final enemy remained. It was the most ancient one of all. Fear. Army psychologists stationed in England documented a terrifying pattern. They called it threat fixation collapse. A gunner, in training, could recite the new rules perfectly. 3 plane lengths forward. He knew what to do. But in combat, as a German FW-190 came screaming in, head-on, cannons flashing from its wings, the primal brain took over. The rational mind evaporated. The part of the brain that dealt with threats screamed one word: danger. And the gunners, despite all their training, would correct themselves. Their aim would drift, away from the empty sky, back to the propeller, back to the center of the thing that was coming to kill them. They were aiming at the threat, and in that final, fatal second, their bullets passed harmlessly behind it. They died, victims of their own instincts. There was only one solution. The technique couldn't just be learned. It had to be embedded. It had to be drilled so deep that it became more powerful than the fear itself. Training programs were revolutionized. The 4-week course became 10 weeks. The 1,000 practice rounds became 5,000. Trainees spent day after day shooting at high-speed targets, over and over, until their hands moved without thought. The veteran gunner, the one who survived, was the one who had successfully rewired his own brain. His conscious mind could be screaming, but his hands, operating on a new, deeper instinct, stayed steady. They kept the guns pointed at that patch of empty sky, trusting that physics would fly the enemy into his stream of fire. The transformation was one of the most significant tactical shifts of the war. The 4% hit rate climbed, by late 1944, to over 20%. Formations that had been helpless began to fight back. Enemy fighters that had attacked with impunity were now being torn from the sky. Thousands of aircrew, who would have been statistics, flew home. The war ended, but the principle endured. The deflection problem is a fundamental truth of combat. The Mark 14 gun sight evolved. It became the radar-assisted gun systems in Korea. It became the digital fire control computers in Vietnam. Today, it's the phalanx cannon on a Navy destroyer, a spinning Gatling gun whose radar brain solves Puckle's equations 4,500 times a minute. It's the AMRAAM missile, which doesn't fly to where a target is, but to a predicted intercept point miles away. It's even in the video games we play, teaching a new generation to lead the target. The story of the aerial gunner is a profound and timeless human lesson. It's the story of a moment when our most trusted, fundamental instincts became our deadliest enemy. It proved that survival, in a new and complex world, sometimes requires a terrifying act of faith, to ignore the reality our eyes show us, and to trust in the invisible laws that we know to be true. It was, and still is, the ultimate triumph of reason over reflex, of physics over fear.